Three separate sources have described the same phenomenon to me. Major Republican donors are asking questions they never asked before, not about policy positions or campaign strategies, but about long term viability and legal exposure. When you've covered politics long enough, you learn to read the signals that matter more than polling data or cable news chatter. And right now, the signal coming from the donor class is unmistakable. The people who write the seven-figure checks that keep campaigns alive are conducting what amounts to a quiet audit of their political investments. They're asking uncomfortable questions about risk management, about reputation protection, and about whether the current trajectory of the Republican Party serves their long-term interests. This isn't the usual donor drama we see during primary seasons, where wealthy contributors pick favorites and fund competing candidates. This is something more fundamental. According to multiple reports from fundraising events and private meetings, major GOP donors are reassessing not just which candidates to support, but whether the entire structure of their political giving needs to change. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how modern political campaigns actually function. The small dollar donors get the headlines and provide the energy, but the mega donors provide the infrastructure. They fund the polling operations, the data analytics, the ground game in swing states, and the expensive television advertising that still dominates late-stage campaigns. When these donors start asking hard questions, it creates ripple effects that eventually reach every level of the party. What's driving this shift appears to be a combination of factors that have been building for months. Legal analysts have noted that the ongoing investigations and court proceedings create an unprecedented level of uncertainty for political contributors. Donors who are used to calculated risks are finding themselves in uncharted territory, where the legal exposure of their preferred candidates could potentially extend to campaign finance implications. The business community, which has traditionally aligned with Republican economic policies, is reportedly expressing concerns about the predictability they need for long-term planning. According to sources familiar with recent donor meetings, there's a growing sentiment that constant controversy makes it difficult to focus on the policy agenda that originally attracted their support. This creates a fascinating dynamic within the Republican establishment. On one hand, you have the grassroots energy that drives primary victories and generates enthusiasm at rallies. On the other hand, you have the institutional funding apparatus that makes general election victories possible. When these two forces begin pulling in different directions, it creates the kind of tension that can reshape a political party. Several veteran Republican fundraisers have reportedly been fielding calls from donors who want to understand their options. These aren't necessarily donors who are abandoning conservative politics, but rather contributors who are looking for ways to support their policy priorities while managing what they perceive as increasing political risk. The conversations happening in these private donor meetings are reportedly focused on electability in a way that goes beyond traditional polling metrics. Donors are asking about legal calendars, about potential complications from ongoing investigations, and about how various scenarios might affect down-ballot races. These are the kinds of strategic calculations that don't happen in public, but they drive the mechanics of how campaigns get funded and organized. What makes this particularly significant is the timing. We're entering the critical phase of the 2024 election cycle, where major funding commitments typically get locked in. The infrastructure for a presidential campaign, the staff, the technology, the data operations, requires months of advanced planning and substantial upfront investment. When major donors hesitate to make those commitments, it can cascade through the entire campaign ecosystem. Some political observers have noted parallels to previous moments in Republican history when the donor class played a decisive role in shaping the party's direction. The difference now is the speed and scale of modern campaigns, which makes early funding decisions more consequential than ever. The response from various political camps has been telling in its diversity. Some operatives are reportedly working to reassure donors by emphasizing poll numbers and primary victories. Others are quietly suggesting that the concerns about legal complications are overblown. But there's also a third group that seems to be acknowledging donor concerns and exploring alternative approaches to building winning coalitions. This isn't just about presidential politics. Down-ballot candidates who rely on national donor networks are watching these dynamics closely. A senator running for re-election in a purple state needs access to the same funding sources that power presidential campaigns. If those sources become more selective or redirect their priorities, It affects races across the entire ballot. The geographic aspect of this shift is particularly interesting. Donors in traditional Republican strongholds like Texas and Florida are reportedly having different conversations than donors in swing states or blue states where Republicans need to appeal to moderate voters. The regional differences in donor sentiment could influence how the party approaches different electoral maps and demographic challenges. Legal experts have noted that the intersection of campaign finance law and ongoing investigations creates complexities that didn't exist in previous election cycles. Donors who are accustomed to straightforward political contributions are now consulting with attorneys about potential implications they never had to consider before. The media strategy around donor relations has also evolved. Unlike previous cycles where major contributors often sought public recognition for their political involvement, many are now reportedly preferring to keep their contributions and their concerns private. This shift toward discretion makes it harder to track the full scope of how donor sentiment is changing, but it also suggests that the concerns are serious enough to warrant careful consideration. What happens next depends largely on how various political figures respond to these donor concerns. Some appear to be doubling down on their current approach, betting that grassroots enthusiasm can compensate for any hesitation from major contributors. Others seem to be adjusting their strategies to address the specific concerns that donors are raising. The institutional Republican Party finds itself in a delicate position. Party officials need to maintain unity while also ensuring that the funding infrastructure remains intact for down-ballot races and long-term party building. This requires a careful balance between acknowledging donor concerns and maintaining support from the activist base. For voters trying to understand how this affects them, the key is recognizing that campaign funding decisions made in private meetings often determine which candidates have the resources to compete effectively in general elections. The policy debates that happen on the campaign trail are important, but they only matter if candidates have the funding infrastructure to reach voters with their messages. The 2024 election cycle is shaping up to be a test of whether the Republican Party can maintain the coalition of grassroots activists and institutional donors that has powered its electoral success in recent decades. The early signs from the donor community suggest that coalition is under more stress than many observers previously recognized. Whether this leads to a fundamental realignment of Republican politics or simply a temporary adjustment in funding strategies remains to be seen. What's clear is that the conversations happening in donor meetings across the country are likely to influence the shape of American politics for years to come. The questions being asked today about viability and exposure will ultimately be answered by voters, but the resources available to make those arguments will be determined by decisions being made in private right now.